In the spring of 1082, the great fortress of Dyrrhachium had fallen, and Byzantium's Balkan defences were in shambles. The old fox Guiscard had left his son in charge of the Byzantine campaign, himself having returned to Italy to rescue the Pope from the ambitions of the German king. In Greece, the showdown between an untested young Norman warlord and the cunning Eastern Roman Emperor would decide the fate of Eastern Rome, while the old fox's final romp in Italy would cement the Normans' legacy in the Catholic West. By this point, you probably have watched everything on your streaming services, are bored and are in need of more content. The sponsor of this video, NordVPN, has you covered. NordVPN is not only a VPN service that protects your communications and personal data, but its 5,500 super-fast servers located in 60 countries will allow you to change your IP to avoid regional restrictions. Trust us, being geo-locked is no fun, and with NordVPN you'll be able to connect to get more content out of your streaming subscriptions. Also, it's important to keep our browsing info safe from the prying eyes of the ISPs, and NordVPN will do just that. You can even use it in countries where VPNs are banned. NordVPN never logs your data and protects your information in public spaces by using double data encryption. It works on Windows, Linux, iOS and Android, and has 24/7 customer support and a 30-day money-back guarantee. And most impressively, you can get all that for $3.49 per month. So what are you waiting for? Support us and get a free month of premium VPN and save 70% at nordvpn.com/kingsandgenerals or the link in the description. Don't forget to use the coupon code KINGSANDGENERALS. In the months following the fall of Dyrrhachium, Guiscard and his armies marched eastwards, taking the city of Castoria with ease, where they rested and prepared an offensive on Alexios' temporary base of Thessaloniki. In April, word of the brewing revolts in Apulia reached Duke Robert, and the old warlord hastily departed back home to quell the rebellion, setting the stage for the coming contest between Bohemond and the Byzantine Emperor Alexios I Komnenos, who, despite being bloodied, was not ready to throw in the towel. Surprisingly, Bohemond's first course of action was not to strike at Thessaloniki as his father had planned, but to take his troops and march southwest to the capital of Epirus, Ioannina. On his way through Thessaly, he found his army supplemented by the local Vlachs, a collection of peoples who existed in pockets throughout the Balkans. These Aromanians, as they were also known, had been chafing under the heavy taxation and corrupt bureaucracy of the Byzantine Empire for decades, and saw common cause with the Normans. By the end of April, Bohemond's army had reached Ioannina. The city quickly surrendered to spare itself from the ruthless pillaging that the Normans were infamous for. Bohemond spent the next few months fortifying its defences. Meanwhile, Alexios had retreated to Constantinople, where he had managed to scrape together another new army, despite depleted resources. The total size of this army is lost to history, but it likely outnumbered Bohemond's expeditionary force. Sometime in the summer, Alexios' host had arrived in the hinterlands just outside Ioannina. The shrewd emperor had learned from his loss at Dyrrhachium. To counteract the thundering impact of a Norman cavalry charge, he had a squadron of light chariots hidden behind a front line of infantry, with riders hiding beneath the vehicles. The plan was to lead the Normans into believing that the Byzantines were a primarily foot soldier-based army, prompting them to commit to a full-scale charge. When the enemy knights came within striking distance, the front line would split and the riders would rush onto their chariots, using their superior mobility to outmaneuver, flank and destroy. This, however, would never come to pass. Bohemond evidently had learned of the Greeks' plans beforehand, and responded by simply dividing his cavalry into two wings, charging into the Byzantine forces' left and right flank to catch them in a pincer movement, rendering them unable to maneuver around them. Caught entirely by surprise, most of Alexios' army fled the field, while many were slaughtered in a brutal melee. Ioannina remained in Norman hands. Humiliated once more, Alexios limped back to Thessaloniki. where he consolidated what remained of his levies, all the while confiscating the treasures of the Orthodox Church. This was deeply unpopular with the clergy, but it allowed the emperor to replenish his army with mercenaries. Bohemond, meanwhile, had marched his victorious forces southwards to the city of Arta, which he laid siege to. Just like Dyrrhachium and Ioannina, Alexios marched once more to relieve the latest city that had fallen into Norman clutches. Once more he predicted a full frontal cavalry charge, and this time laid a perimeter of caltrops hidden in the tall grass a ways ahead of his front line. His plan was to use the traps to pierce the Norman horses' flesh, throwing them into chaos, at which point the Byzantine light cavalry, situated on the wings, would charge into their left and right flank. Bohemond, however, was of a simpler mind. Deciding to simply use what had worked before, he once more divided his knights into a left and right wing, barreling into the Byzantine forces in a pincer yet again, bypassing the caltrops, which had only been laid before the front lines. Furthermore, Alexios had not accounted for his army's low morale. Terrified of the Normans, who thus far had made mincemeat of them in every battle they fought, the Greeks and their mercenaries either fled the field or were slaughtered. Seeing yet another battle lost, Alexios fled back to Constantinople. With Alexios stuck licking his wounds in the capital, Bohemond took the initiative and advanced northeast, subduing the city of Skopje and the surrounding towns, before marching back south to Kastoria by mid-autumn. With the weather turning bleak, the young Norman warlord had to make a choice: settle in for the winter or continue his advance. Knowing the climate of Western Macedonia to be chilly and damp, and not wanting to risk sickness spreading through his army, Bohemond decided to push southeast to the sunny, fertile plains of Thessaly. To that end, the Norman knights pointed their lances at the region's capital, the city of Larissa. If Byzantine sources are to be believed, the Franco-Norsemen appeared before the walls of Larissa on November 3rd, laying siege to the city and cutting it off from the outside world. The city defense was headed by a veteran soldier named Leocephalus, who remained ardently loyal to his emperor in Constantinople. Leo defiantly held out against Bohemond for over 6 months, but as winter turned to spring, morale in the city began to plummet as the Larissans starved under the Norman blockade. Meanwhile, Emperor Alexios, predictably, had not yet given up. Despite suffering crushing loss after crushing loss, the remarkably stubborn Roman would not turn his back on his dying empire. First, he resorted to diplomacy. Using the same underhanded tactics that had sent Guiscard rushing back to Italy, he found a way to spread whispers into the Norman camp, lighting the fires of conspiracy. 3 senior generals in the Norman army, Peter of Ulp and 2 men named Reinaldus and William, were accused by the rest of the Franco-Norsemen of scheming to defect to the Byzantines. This created a rift within Bohemond's leadership corps, no doubt dealing a blow to Norman morale and buying Alexios some time. Meanwhile, using what remained of Byzantine coffers and confiscated church artifacts, Alexios managed to purchase for himself a mercenary army of 7,000 Seljuk Turks, loaned to him by the Rum Sultan Suleiman I. Despite being the recent enemies of the Eastern Romans, it can be surmised that the Turks had a vested interest in ensuring that an army of zealous Latin knights did not advance right onto their doorstep. In March of 1083, Alexios began his westward march for one final decisive battle with the Normans. Joined by Greek levies from Thessaloniki and some Pecheneg sellswords on the way, he passed his army through the narrow Tempe Valley and via the river Peneus, making his camp in the town of Trikala, where he began formulating his plan of attack. With each defeat, Alexios had adapted his strategy, and this time was no different. He knew that his troops were comparatively low in experience and morale compared to the veteran, battle-hardened Norman knights, and that therefore any direct confrontation with the Latin enemy would result in yet another crushing loss. To that end, he apprehended a local Thessalian farmer and had him educate his generals on every detail of the local terrain, with the intention of planning an ambush. On a sunny summer's morning, sometime in July of 1083, a line of Byzantine soldiers appeared on the plains of Larissa's eastern approach. Led by the generals Nicephorus Melissenus and Basil Curticius, their imperial banners flew proudly, challenging the Normans to fight. Believing the flags to represent the main Roman army, Bohemond immediately ordered his knights to mount up. With himself at the head of one squadron, and his trusted officer Brienne at the other, they barreled down in a full frontal cavalry charge upon the Byzantine line. This time, however, would not be like the others. Instead of engaging in a general melee, the Byzantines began a planned retreat to a place called Lycostomion, the Wolf's Mouth. It was here Alexios' genius finally pulled through. Setting his ambush into action, the Greek emperor ordered a contingent of mounted archers and peltasts to begin harassing the charging Norman knights from the flank, prompting them to break their pursuit. This worked like a charm, as Count Brienne peeled off his squadron of knights to charge at his harassers. Unfortunately for him, the Normans' heavy cavalry proved unable to outmaneuver the likely Turkic mounted archers, who circled around them with ease, shooting out the horses from under the Latin knights and raining chaos upon them. Brienne made a desperate attempt to call for reinforcements, but he had been separated from Bohemond's squadron, and communication lines had been cut. Meanwhile, Bohemond himself had broken off his pursuit of the Byzantine decoy army and made a temporary camp on a small river island called Salabria, a narrow region of the outskirts of Larissa defined by marshy swamplands. According to Byzantine sources, Bohemond did not take his situation very seriously, reportedly having been lounging around eating grapes. Sometime later, Brienne's squadron had likely managed to link back up with Bohemond, and their ragged, wounded state alerted the young Norman duke to the reality of the threat he faced. The next morning, Alexios bore the full might of his army down upon Bohemond's camp. His Turkic and Pecheneg horse archers circled around the narrow marshlands, peppering the heavily armoured knights with arrows in an attempt to draw them out of their camp and expose themselves. Learning from Brienne's mistake, Bohemond did not take the bait, ordering his warriors to remain dismounted and to form a phalanx with their lances and shields, turtling down to protect themselves from the missiles. Pinned down and trapped, it was clear that Alexios finally had the upper hand. The contest was decided when a stray arrow struck Bohemond's standard-bearer, causing the Normans to panic, break formation, and flee westwards to Trikala. Finally, it was Alexios who saw the Normans' jugular exposed, and he went all in to end their campaign for good. Having sowed the seeds of division in the Norman ranks even before the battle, and knowing now that defeat would have shattered their morale further, Alexios promised lavish gifts and high court titles to any Norman noble who would desert Bohemond and join him. Bohemond found himself unable to match Alexios' extravagant offers, nor was he even able to pay his soldiers for the 2.5 years of campaigning they had done in the Balkans. Fearing a total mutiny in his army, he was forced to retreat back across the Adriatic, abandoning the lands he had taken in Macedonia and Thessaly to be reconquered by the Eastern Roman Empire. Larissa proved to be a great victory for Alexios, but the emperor was not done yet. He called the Venetians back into action, who surprisingly had remained loyal to Byzantium throughout this whole ordeal. Spurred on with the promise of trade concessions and a colony in Constantinople, the Italian sea lords took to their warships once more, driving the Normans out of Dyrrhachium and Corfu, returning those territories to the Greeks. The Balkan campaign was over. Despite the best efforts of the fearsome Norman knights, the shrewd and practical policies of the Komnenian emperor had won the day and saved the Eastern Roman Empire from total destruction. Meanwhile, back in Italy, Robert Guiscard had little time to process his son's defeat in the east, too busy dealing with the chaos Alexios had created for him on his home turf. He spent 15 months quelling the rebellions in Apulia before finally marching north with an army of at least 4,000 to aid his spiritual suzerain in Rome. For Pope Gregory, the situation was desperate. The German king Henry had more or less taken full control of the Eternal City, leaving the Pope confined in the Castel Sant'Angelo. An anti-pope, Clement III, had been coronated in St. Peter's Basilica at the behest of the king, and in turn had crowned Henry with the symbolic title of Charlemagne, Holy Roman Emperor. Upon hearing that Guiscard was marching to face him, Henry opted to avoid open battle, seeing no need for it. After all, he'd gotten everything he wanted. Perhaps also fearing the martial prowess of the Normans, he and his army retreated back to Germany. When Guiscard arrived at the gates of Rome in 1084, he had expected to be treated like a liberator. Instead, to his unpleasant surprise, he found himself barred by an angry Roman populace who had thrown their support behind Emperor Henry rather than the Pope, who remained hidden in his castle. Naturally, the old warlord was undeterred by this mob and formulated a plan to break through their defences. The bulk of his army remained camped outside the east side of the city, where they skirmished sporadically with the Romans on the walls. Meanwhile, under cover of darkness, he snuck 1,400 men around the walls to the Porta Latina, a small, sparsely defended gate. Shrouded by night, they scaled the battlements and opened the portcullis for the rest of the army, which poured into the city, taking the Romans completely by surprise. From here, sources differ wildly on what happened next. Roman chroniclers bitterly claim that Guiscard's troops committed a brutal and ruthless sacking, slaughtering and violating indiscriminately, while Norman chroniclers assert that Guiscard simply set some buildings aflame to distract the Romans, used it to rescue the Pope, then left the city. It seems most likely that the Normans ravaged their way through the capital and Palatine Hills, looting and pillaging as they had done for years, while burning 8 churches in the process. However, the damage was nowhere near what Rome had seen from its sacks of yore under the Gauls or the Goths. Having lost most of his support, and reviled by the citizens of Rome for his role in the Norman sacking, Pope Gregory was forced into exile in Norman Benevento, where he died a year later. Meanwhile, the Germans' imperial antipope Clement retained power as Christendom's supreme pontiff. As for Guiscard, following his little side quest of sacking the heart of the Catholic world, he set about returning to the main story mission, but his attempt to pick up where he'd left off in Byzantium would end before it truly began. In May of 1085, while rallying his troops on the Greek island of Kephallonia, he succumbed to a disease. Frail and sickly, he passed peacefully in his bed, ending the 4-decade-long career of one of the most successful medieval warriors of all time. The attempted Norman conquest of the Balkans became a watershed moment for the Eastern Roman Empire. In his darkest hour, the shrewd and cunning Emperor Alexios was tested in fire and blood, and during the rest of his enlightened reign, the borders of his empire were secured. Over the next century, his dynasty, the Komnenoi, would retake much of the Balkans and Anatolia, breathing new life into a long-struggling imperium. The death of the cunning fox Guiscard marked the end of an one.